I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Bridget Jaipal Valenza.
I'm Thomas O'Neill White.
I'm Angelique Preston.
We need to get together and let our voices be heard.
This is What's Next, a dedicated hour to have important conversations about the issues facing the marginalized and underrepresented communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario.
We're going to have some real healing. We've got to have space to tell some uncomfortable truth.
What's Next continues our mission to discuss race,
Equity,
And the common concerns of Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
And on What's Next today, we're going to talk with Dr. Keith Burich, Professor Emeritus at Canisius University. I think last time we were, I may have kept mentioning Canisius College.
Still a college then, yes.
It was still a college back then. When you were here the last time, Dr. Burich, we talked about another book of yours. This particular book, though, is the Thomas Indian School and the Irredeemable Children of New York, and we put irredeemable in quotation marks. The Thomas Indian School, one of those still maybe well-kept secrets of Western New York to a certain extent, unfortunately. Let's give an outline of the Thomas Indian School. I'll let you do the work on that.
Well, yeah, you're right. It's a well-kept secret. My work on Indian schools began actually out in South Dakota in Rosebud. One of my trips, many trips out to the West, a good friend of mine, Don Moccasin, who's on the cover of my other book, as you recall, his father was an Episcopal priest, and his grandfather and great-grandfather, and they ran a school on Rosebud called the Bishop Hare School. And I started looking into it, and I did some research on it at Augustine College in Sioux Falls and so on. And I came back here and I was lecturing or something. I can't remember the exact details, but one of my Indian friends said, well, why don't you do something with the Thomas Indian School? I said, what are you talking about? And he said, right here on the Seneca Reservation, Cattaraugus Reservation, was the Thomas Indian School. I said, well, I never heard of it. And I asked other people, and in fact, Indians didn't even know. Some of my Indian friends didn't even know about it. It was one of the best-kept secrets,
Wow.
even though it was a pretty substantial institution. I think at the end, it closed finally in 1957. It had over 300 acres of land, barns, silos, out buildings, and so on. And so I decided to look into it. And it just so happened at that time, there was a reunion of Thomas Indian School students on the Seneca Reservation, Cattaraugus Reservation in Irving. And so I went to it, and they had a presentation at the library there. And one of the women was a Tuscarora from Canada, actually, but she was here in America. Her mother died. She was whisked away from her mother's gravesite, her and her brothers, and taken over to what is now Gateway Longview on Main Street, the Henry D. Knox Home for Children, and then shifted to the Thomas Indian School. And she started talking about it, and she said, well, you know, when I got out, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to live a life outside of an institution. I got married. I had kids. I raised them like I was raised at the Thomas Indian School. And she said, and I'll never forget this, she said, I didn't know how to love. Wasn't a dry eye in the house, including mine. And that was the story that I've heard over and over again about children who went to boarding schools, whether it's a Thomas Indian School or others around the country. They didn't know how to raise families. They didn't know how to hug. They didn't know how to love. And the Thomas Indian School didn't start out as a school. Its original name was the Thomas Asylum for Orphans and Destitute Indian Children, the Asylum for Destitute, Orphan and Destitute Indian Children. It started in 1855, but it really began before that, right here in downtown Buffalo.
You know, and that brings up an interesting part of this story that I think it might be a chance to jump into this right now. I see this story in a lot of different ways. There's so much to it. one part is the results, what life was like for those children who came out of that
Right.
that institution, and how, as you already mentioned, how they didn't know a way to live other than through the institution. But another part of this that you bring up in your book as well is this school, this or asylum, as
is
it was
the
originally
right word.
taught, came out of, also reflected, though, and came out of the really difficult conditions that were on the reservations of New York. And most of that came right after a lot of the treaties had been settled, a lot of displacement had gone on. What was life like on the reservations of New York?
I think it wasn't just the reservations of New York. I mean, you got to
But
put
to
things
this point, yeah.
Yeah, you got to put things in, and this is an important consideration. You got to put things in a larger perspective. In the 19th century, Indians, by the end of the Revolution, and especially into the 19th century, Indians were already being removed. I mean, we always think about the Trail of Tears and
Right.
all that, but it had happened.
And it was
much
happening right here in Western New
Yeah,
York.
and in Western New York. And they were put on reservations or whatever, removed. Most of them, most of the Indians east of the Mississippi were removed west of the Mississippi by the 1830s and 1840s. And reservation life was horrible. They were deprived of a way of living, their way of life, deprived of their land and their way of life, and weren't able, in many cases, to feed themselves and find and continue the way that they had always lived. The result was that on all reservations, populations began to drop. I mean, we know that by the end of the 19th century, the number of Indians in the United States dropped to less than 250,000 from something like 12 million before around 1500. And the result, one of the causes was, of course, warfare. And people have always blamed it on diseases, smallpox, although actually we were vaccinating Indians against smallpox in the 19th century. Most people don't know that. But it was a lot of diseases, but it was also starvation, exposure, and really more than anything else, the way their lives had to change and adjust to the reservations.
And I wrote this down, so maybe it's my term, but this is what I got of it. Social disorganization. Their lives, the way the Indians of New York State, and everywhere, but let's focus on New York State for the matter of this particular conversation, were totally turned around. What had been a way of life for centuries was all of a sudden turned around and left. And you bring it up in the book, and I think it's a worthwhile point. And I think if we all imagine what our lives would be like if all of a sudden they were turned upside down and we were moved,
Right.
what our families would be like.
Right. Families were disrupted. Alcohol was a big problem, and had been a problem. There was violence on the reservations, and like I said, disease, starvation, the total disruption of their way of life. You're right, social disorganization. I hadn't thought about that for a while, and so they really couldn't do what the Seneca, for example, described sovereignty. We carry our own water. They were no longer able to carry their own water, and of course, one of the big problems was that there were all these hostile, land-hungry settlers coming into this region, especially after the Erie Canal opened up in 1825. And eventually, of course, they were, and their biggest reservation was right here in downtown Buffalo, 80,000 acres along the creek. And they finally were able to get rid of them in 1842. The government was ready to get rid of them in 1842. And they went up to Cattaraugus and Allegheny reservations where they live now. In the process, the families, as I said, began to dissolve, to fall apart. One of the problems was, of course, the rate of death. The death rates were terrible. Seneca population fell in the 19th century. I have a statistic that's alarming. In 1900 or 1890, I'm not really sure which one it is, but the life expectancy in the United States was 50. For Seneca, was 30.
Wow.
And that was true for other reservations as well. That left a lot of orphans and destitute Indian children. And the people who started the Thomas Indian School, Laura and Asher Wright, were two Presbyterian missionaries. Well, he had gone to Dartmouth and they came out to minister to the Indians, and they would do it until they died in 1875 and 1880. They were really wonderful in many respects. They took in orphans. They took in sick children here at a mission house in Buffalo. When the Seneca were removed to Cattaraugus in 1842, they went with them, and they continued to minister to them there in a mission house. But then in 1855, in 1850s really, an epidemic hit and produced more orphan and destitute Indian children. So in 1855, they got a charter with the help of a guy named William Letchworth, and $100, a princely sum of $100 from Philip Thomas, who happened to be the president, a Quaker, by the way, president of B&O Railroad.
Oh, okay.
And he gave them $100, and that's where the name Thomas comes from, the Thomas Indian School. But it started out as the Thomas Asylum for Orphaned and Destitute Indian Children. And they started with 10, and that wasn't enough. Soon they were up. They're going to be, by the 1870s, over 80. They had a new building. The stories about the building was in the Buffalo News and the Courier at that point.
And if I recall in your book, 5,000 people came to the cornerstone ceremony.
And they gave money. They gave money to support the school. And one of the visitors was Susan B. Anthony.
Wow.
This was a famous occasion. And they lasted for quite a while on that money and on other gifts over time. But the increasing number of students calling on them and the philanthropy kind of petered out after the Civil War. People weren't quite as generous, I guess, or they had other concerns or whatever. But they finally, in 1875, had to turn to the state. Asher Wright, the superintendent or headmaster or the missionary that had started the school, went to Albany, got a charter. Got the State Board of Charities to take it over. And for the first few years, it really didn't matter. But then things changed drastically.
You got into it, and it's worth now the distinction after New York State takes this over. Again, and it's interesting also to put that juxtaposition about how excited it seemed, how the society in general was thrilled to have this opportunity to help these young children out. But that changes as the institution moves on, and there's a big distinction, and you make this frequently in your book, that the children went from being children, students, to really being classified as inmates.
Yeah. And immediately after Asher Wright, that was the last act that he had as the headmaster or superintendent of the school, was to hand it over to the state. He died shortly thereafter. Right. One of the people who had worked there, the men who had worked there, took over the job, and it really didn't change much for a few years. But then a new headmaster or superintendent came in, a guy named von Valkenburg, came from the School for the Blind, because the Board of Charities really had a number of asylums. Asylum was a popular word at that time. It doesn't have the sinister meaning that it has today. So there were asylums for epileptics, for lunatics, for idiots. I mean, they had all
and these are real terms. We're not just
these are their terms, not mine.
Right.
And defective children. I don't know what the heck that meant, but it was they had all kinds of asylums. When he took over, he began to change things, and then that's when they became not school children, not orphans or destitute Indian children. They became inmates or wards of the state.
Huge distinction.
Yeah, and the state now had custody over them. And as I said, immediately things didn't change, but gradually they did. And one of the big changes, in some ways the state did some good things, changed the dorms from fire traps to brick buildings, and they started a nursery, a kindergarten, and actually upgraded the curriculum. But one of the things they did was to have a contract for the parents or guardians that committed the children, because once they put them in, they weren't going to get them out. The first contract was restrictive. The people had to, the parents or guardians or whomever committed them had to notify the school in writing 30 days in advance. Well, many of the Indians didn't speak English, didn't write.
As a matter of fact, I think you mentioned most of them marked X.
Yeah, they had to
put the
sign
mark.
X's when they put them in there. So they weren't able to put a request in writing.
That they were
30 days.
surrendering all their
Yeah.
rights to their children.
And eventually they increased the restrictions so that not only could they not get them out very easily, but they couldn't encourage them. If they encouraged them, they were subject to punishment. The parents were, or guardians, or whomever it was that did that. And they now became inmates, as I said, wards of the state, and the school eventually became more and more prison-like. One of the things that I heard from the people that I interviewed, even much later, of course, these people would be there in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the constant surveillance that they were under. Every bit of their life was regulated, first by a whistle that told them where to go. There were always people looking after them, making sure that they were doing their chores, making sure that they were studying, making sure that they weren't misbehaving. There was a line drawn down the middle of the campus as it grew, and that was designed to keep the sexes apart, the genders apart. And that's what the term crossed the line. It didn't cross the line.
Okay.
If you did, you were going to be punished.
And the punishments could be severe.
Some of them could be, yeah. But I think most of them were more just assigning them more disagreeable or onerous chores.
Right.
But yeah, sometimes especially the boys.
Right.
The women told me that the boys had it worse than the girls. They could be beaten for having stepped out of line. Of course, the worst thing was to run away,
Which happened frequently.
Yes, it did, so they were punished, and they were watched constantly, as I said. And you have to start to think about this, what it would be like. Some of these children, because they had a nursery now, and they had a kindergarten. These kids were coming in awfully young. You have to stop and think about what it would be like with your children or anybody's children, handing them over to perfect strangers who didn't speak their language, who didn't understand them, who had total control over every aspect of their lives. They were housed in dormitories, 26 to a bunk room, and watched over by matrons. And now you understand why, when they get out, they don't know how the heck to raise kids. They don't know how to live a normal life without somebody telling them what to do every minute of the day. It was the trauma that those children must have gone through is hard to imagine.
Right. Taken away from their parents.
Away from their parents or tribes or communities or whatever, right, and placed in the care of total strangers who had total control over their lives.
And they would be there perhaps maybe for another decade, maybe even longer in some cases.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that happened also. In 1904, compulsory education came into play. So now they had to stay until they were 16. And many of them did, but many of them also, when they got to be 16 or even 18 and graduated from high school, because they could graduate from high school, didn't know what to do. They had no place to go, no homes to return to. There are stories that I tell in the book and others that I heard. When they did go home, everything had changed. they weren't always notified when their parents died. So they would go home and their parents weren't there. And their parents were discouraged from ever seeing them, meeting with them, coming to see them, visit them is what the word that I'm trying to get,
Right.
Visit them. And then there were various reasons. Alcohol was always the big reason, or there were diseases or whatever. But parents were discouraged from coming to visit their kids. And in many cases, as the institution grew, you're now taking Indians not just from Seneca nations, but from the Tuscarora up by Niagara Falls, the Onondaga out in Syracuse, the Mohawks up near Montreal, even non-Iroquois, non-Haudenosaunee Indians, Shinnecock from out on the end of Long Island ended up there, and some from Canada. So they were a long way away from home, and going home was not going to be easy. And when they got there, it had all changed, and their parents were gone, their siblings were gone. And that was another thing. They were also separated from their siblings at the school by age and by gender. One Seneca told me, when he left, all of his family had gone to Thomas Indian School. They were all different ages, so they all left at different times and went their different ways. When they finally got out and got back together, the only thing they had in common was alcohol. And that was a scourge of the many of the people who got out of the Thomas Indian School and other boarding schools as well.
Thanks for joining us today. This is What's Next on WBFO. More to come right after this.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
We're talking with Dr. Keith Burich this morning on What's Next, the author of The Thomas Indian School and the Irredeemable Children of New York. You were talking about how parents were discouraged from seeing their children at the Thomas School. Also, if I'm not mistaken, and maybe expand on this, it also became a little bit of a philosophy from above that the people who were running the school did not want the influence of the Indian tribes coming into the school.
That's right. The whole idea, the idea of Indian education begins in the 17th century, and it goes all the way into the 20th century. And the whole idea was to acculturate and assimilate Indian children. What that meant initially was teach them English, teach them Christianity, Christianize them, and teach them how to farm. Women were supposed to do housewifery, as it was called. Also, I always call it the gospel of soap, because Indians were dirty and slovenly, and we got to scrub them, and maybe if we scrub them, we'll scrub them white.
And just as a side, I do believe you had an anecdote from a woman who was there at Thomas who literally tried to scrub her skin color off.
Yeah, and that was one of the effects of it. That they began to think of themselves as different, as inferior, or something wrong with them. Why am I here? Well, because I'm an Indian. Well, if I'm an Indian and I'm here, there must be something wrong with me. And that was something that happened to them. To get back to the parents, because this is a story that it came after I wrote the book. And I was at a reunion. There's one every September, and I just was there not too long ago. And this woman came up to me, and she said, she actually disagreed with some of the things I said in the book.
Okay.
But she said she had a good time there, or at least it wasn't as bad as most people think it was. At any rate, she said, but one thing I want to thank you for is pointing out that the school discouraged my parents from coming to see their children. I always wondered why. Now, this woman's in her 70s or 80s by this time. I always wondered why my mother never came to visit me. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't speak. here was a woman in her 70s and 80s who was still haunted by the fact that her parents never came to visit her. And when you think about the trauma that those kids had when they were taken away from their parents, taken away from their siblings, put in a strange environment, housed with 26 strange kids in a bunk room, watched over, controlled constantly, how that trauma affected them, not just when they were young or while they were at the school, but would continue to haunt them for the rest of their lives. That's the story of the Thomas Indian School in a capsule. And I was shocked. It's not that I hadn't thought about it, but I never had it put that way for me. And I'll never forget that story. As I've said to you and I say in the book, I shed a lot of tears over this. I've heard a lot of horrible stories. That was just one of them.
What were the days like at the Thomas School?
It was standard boarding school fare. That actually started way back when, in the 18th century. I know that the Moores boarding school, which was the precursor of Dartmouth, was an Indian school first. And what they did there, the Thomas Indian School did, and all other boarding schools, half a day of work every day. That was called the half-day system. The men did farming because the whole idea was to teach them how to farm like white people. Because Indians used hoe agriculture, and women did most of the work, of the agricultural work at any rate, not the other work, but teach the men how to farm. Use, they would say, the white man's plow, rather than using hoes to cultivate the land. And there would be, of course, school, all administered with a heavy dose of religion, because almost every school, whether it was a federal school, a state school, or a denominational school, believed that you had to Christianize the Indians. Not necessarily turn them into Catholics. That was still that was a taboo until later in the 19th century. But you wanted to Christianize them. And that was what they did. And, of course, they had chores of one kind or another. I know at Thomas, it snows. Just go out and clear the snow. That kind of thing. Harvest the crops. Feed the cows, the chickens, the pigs, and all the kinds of things that agricultural, that farmers had to do. And that's what you were training them to do. Women, for their part, had to do very similar, had a very similar schedule. Up early, by the way, they were always told when to wake up and when to change chores by the whistle. So they were never allowed to just wander around and go from chore to chore on their own. They had to do it precisely by the whistle. The women cleaned. They did laundry. They cooked. They made clothes. All of the clothes at the Thomas and other schools was made by the women at the schools, right down to their underwear. I was a little surprised at that, but I figured, well, where else would they get underwear?
Right.
They make them. They made all the clothes. They did all the cleaning. They did everything. As I said, one of the reasons was that from the very beginning, when we're coming up on Thanksgiving, the Pilgrims thought that Indians were dirty and slovenly and filthy and needed to be scrubbed clean. And that was what they were doing. That they said the gospel of soap. And so that was what their lives were like, regulated. They did get an education. The state did provide them with some amenities. I mean, one of the women just at the last reunion I was at said, "Oh, boy, we had this great swimming pool." And they did. They had a high board and a low board, and she thought it was wonderful. So the state did provide them with amenities. They did go and do things. Going to the Erie County Fair was a big deal because they would show off their wares and their animals and so on. But when they went off the reservation, and they always felt strange. They always had to wear uniforms that were made for them. Why didn't the other kids have to wear uniforms? The other kids went home. why don't we go home? One woman told me that when she got out, and she went to a nursing school, and in Oklahoma, I think, or Kansas. And she said, she and the other girls were going to go to the movies. She didn't know how to pay. Because everything had been taken care of for them. They didn't know how, when they got out, either how to pay rent, how to pay electricity, how to do the kinds of things that children learn normally from their parents, just watching their parents. They had no such instruction because everything was handled for them. Even this one, something that surprised me. Some of the boys went to the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, during the Depression. Everybody got money that was sent home. My father did.
Right.
He was in the CCC, and his money was sent home to his mother to support the family. Their money went to the school, and the school wouldn't necessarily give it to them because it was afraid that they would blow it on alcohol or whatever it might be. Every aspect of their life was regulated. So when they get out, what are they going to do? It was a very difficult transition that many of them did not make very well.
Let's talk about, and you most certainly cite a lot of examples from various sources in your book, but let's talk about what did happen to some of these children, what their lives were like after they left, after this time of working half a day out on the farm and shoveling snow and going to school, but being totally separated from their families, and also, as you mentioned, everything was decided for them as well. What was their lives? Again, there's a lot of examples where we can go to, but let's talk about some of those.
A couple of things. A couple of people, especially women, told me that they didn't know what a normal life was like. So they get out, they get a job or do whatever. They get married. They don't know how to raise their families. The one that I was telling you about earlier that introduced me to this whole thing, Frida Kraft was her name. She said that when she had her on weekends, when the kids were home from school and everything, she had them scrubbing the house from top to bottom. That's because that's what they did. That's what you had to do. Others of them told me that they because they didn't know what a normal life was like. One of them, Katie Wheeler is her name, she told me she used to drive by houses and see the lights on, and wonder, what was their life like? Am I leading a normal life? Am I doing with it? She was also one that told me she couldn't hug her children until later in life and tell them that she loved them. So for many of them, it was a very agonizing experience. The boys, especially during and after World War II, would go into the service. But alcohol was a real problem for them. Any number of stories, I won't tell you all of them,
Sure.
But that became a problem. So they didn't know how to just do the normal kinds of things that everybody else learned how to do. So, they were isolated from the time, in some cases, they were born, just about, because that nursery was almost a foundling nursery. They had infants in it all the way to the time they were 16 or 18. In some cases, some of them couldn't leave and continued to live there and found jobs and did other things, but they would stay until they were 20, 21 because they had no place to go, didn't know what else to do, and the school kind of relied on them to do things and work around the school and that sort of thing. But they found it very difficult to adjust. It took a long, long time, if they ever did. And I think that was the thing that I learned most, was the long-term effects that these schools had on the children. There's something called epigenesis. I don't know if you've ever heard about it.
No.
It's, your basic genes don't change, but because of traumatic experiences, whatever those trauma might be, it might be warfare, might be some horrendous event in your life, your genes are scarred. And they're not changed, but on top of them there's a scar or whatever, and it affects behavior. And the theory is that the problem on reservations today and in the past about alcohol abuse, for example, was the result of this trauma being carried forward on their genes. And so they would, whenever they got into situations, the alcohol would trigger them to drink, and eventually they become dependent on alcohol or drugs. And I often thought about that when I was writing this book and talking to people, that their genes were probably scarred, and that it was going to take a lot of work, if possible, to overcome the trauma that was grafted onto their genetic, their genes.
Stay with us. There's more to come. This is What's Next on WBFO.
Listen to Mindful Music Saturdays at 4 p.m. and Sundays at 8 p.m. on WBFO.
Attention, parents and teachers. Find free learning resources, including lesson plans and videos for all ages at pbslearningmedia.org.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the WBFO app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@wbfo.org. Together we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
I'm talking with Dr. Keith Burich from the Professor Emeritus at Canisius University. His book, The Thomas Indian School and the Irredeemable Children of New York. I think this might be an opportunity to talk about someone who I guess comes in, if not necessarily of a hero, but she most certainly puts things into perspective. And this is a social worker who comes along, was it Catherine Tidd?
Tidd, yes.
Who, and this is now what, we're in like the 20s and 30s, I think, right?
Well, no, she'd be in the 40s.
The 40s, okay.
Yeah.
So she comes in and she sees, now we've kind of glossed over how the school had maybe changed more into a state institution and maybe even got further and further away from its original goals, perhaps, or its original mission. But she comes in and really takes a good, hard look at what had been going on at the Thomas School. And the one thing that sticks out is how she talks about how there was no individual assessment of each student there. That because they were Indians, they were all the same and treated the same. And that had its own tragic consequences.
I mean, one size fits all is the way it was. It was for everything, for healthcare, for education, for everything that went on in their lives. Yeah, I mean, everybody was treated exactly the same. Poorly, but
the same.
But the same.
But everybody, back to it, everybody had different needs.
Oh,
and
yes.
Yet they weren't being attended to.
Yeah. And one guy told me that when he got there, he was maybe 5 or 6, something like that. Young, but not really, not an infant. He said he went in. When they brought the children in, they were automatically quarantined, to check for diseases, because one of the problems on the reservation was a number of diseases that could be spread, and put them together in a dorm room, and God knows what would happen to him. And he was put into it, and he had a nervous breakdown. And they kept him quarantined for a whole year. That was just the way they did things. There was no real assessment, no psychiatrist coming in to check them, no child psychiatrist or psychologist or expert coming in to check them. They were just quarantined. And he said that set him back, and it had a real terrible effect on him. He blames a lot of the things that happened to him after Thomas, especially the alcohol abuse, on what that initial experience was, that it scarred him and changed him for the worse. And that's because everybody was treated exactly the same. That's what uniforms do. They break down your individuality and make you part of the group. And people even told me that in the dorms, the matrons or whoever was in charge of them would have the children sort of beat up the younger children coming in to make sure that they behaved and fell in line and didn't get uppity or try to be different. And that was part of the whole system, was to treat them exactly the same. And one of the reasons is, and that's one of the reasons the book is called Irredeemable. The first missionaries that were there, and not just Asher and Laura Wright, but others, and there were other missionaries that had tried to establish schools there. And they came and went, students came and went, the schools came and went. The Wright started the one that lasted longest, but by the way, that's probably one of the longest lasting boarding schools in America.
Right.
Carlisle lasted about 40 years, and that's always considered the model, but the Thomas Indian School lasted much longer. The basic assumption of the missionaries going way back was that children were redeemable. They were Christians, and Christian redemption. After the state took over, they didn't believe the Indians could be redeemable. There's a phrase that I use in the book that comes straight from the state. At the school like Thomas, there were other institutions, other asylums, but the one like Thomas was for crippled, defective, and Indian children. They lumped Indian children together with crippled and defective children. And so they didn't really think that Indian children could be redeemed. What they could be was controlled. And somehow or another, through control and punishment and keeping them long enough, if you kept them long enough, they would somehow become, they would somehow be able to lead a normal life after they got out, but that wasn't going to be the case.
You mentioned the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania,
right.
One of the federal Indian boarding schools. They are already fading, closing, yet Thomas in New York State keeps going into the 50s.
Yeah, because they really did not believe that, as I said, the Indians could be redeemed. I mean, we got a problem. It's called the Indian problem. Now, there are lots of different solutions all over the country and over time for it, but one of the solution for New York was to put them into the Thomas Indian School and hope for the best. And what were they going to do? Well, we're going to educate them. We're going to teach them some skills. We're going to Christianize them, and hopefully by controlling them every aspect of their life, it will teach them not to be Indians.
The skills that were taught and that's another part of the kind of hidden part of this, was that women were taught domestic
work
skills.
Yeah.
Men were taught how to be farmhands, basically. And there wasn't huge. I mean, people would find some work doing that, but there was these weren't the skills of the day that were being taught elsewhere.
Some of the other boarding schools actually did teach kids to be mechanics, because by the 1920s already people were driving cars and they needed mechanics. They were learning kind of industrial skills for an industrial America. New York was teaching them to be farmers. And they could be farmhands, but there weren't many jobs. They're never probably going to be able to own land and farm, because farming costs money. I mean, you got to have tractors, you got to have implements, you got to have seed. All those things are money to get started. Where are these Indian kids going to get that? And farming already by even 1900 was beginning to fade in America.
Right.
Many of them were leaving and going to the cities. And so where are these kids going to find jobs as farmhands? You're right. And women were going to be domestic servants. That was what they were learning to do. New York, Thomas Indian School, we haven't mentioned, is the only state-run school in America. Out of 300 and some boarding schools, most of them denominational and small and kind of ephemeral, none of them were states-run. They were either denominational or federal schools. New York ran the only one, and what they did to the Indians was based on this assumption that they were somehow defective. There was something wrong with being Indians, and that was what the students learned. There's something wrong with me.
We're coming down to our final 8 or 9 minutes here, Dr. Burich. The book is well done. I must give you compliments on that. But let me throw this out at you. Why is it important for society today to understand what happened at Thomas?
Well, I think it's not just Thomas. I mean, if it were only Thomas, it would be sad and tragic. But it's all part of a much larger, even sadder and more tragic story that goes back 500 years, just about. The way we treated the children at the Thomas Indian School and at other boarding schools. And I think we have to put Thomas in that context of the boarding school movement, was reflected the attitude that Americans had towards Indians. By 1900, when the Indian population was dropping drastically, and it wouldn't rebound for several decades, many Americans thought, you know what? They're going to vanish anyway. We don't really have to take care of them. The problem is that unless you were willing to do it by the sword, in the meantime, you got to do something with them.
Right.
They didn't just vanish. And what happened was that the way in which we never stopped to think about what we had done to Indians. So what the Thomas Indian School and other boarding schools, the stories of those schools, is that it teaches us, and why it's important today, what we did to Indians and what we're still doing to Indians. I mean, the Thomas Indian School ended in 1957. That's a long time ago,
right.
But I was still around. I was around, and some of them are still around.
Right.
Some of my friends are former students. So I think what the Thomas Indian School and the story of boarding schools is, it teaches us the role that race, for one thing, racism played in American, with regard to the Indians, played in American history. And we can't hide from it, and we shouldn't hide from it. And this is just a reminder of the kinds of things that were done to the Indians. And while the Seneca, for example, are doing much better, largely because of casinos. I mean, they're benefiting from it. If you go to other reservations, it's not the same. And the poverty, the crime, the alcohol and drug abuse, the diseases, they're still there. And what we have had, the treatment of Indians in America amounts to a kind of malignant contempt and neglect. We didn't like them. We didn't like them from the beginning. So let's neglect them and hope that they go away. The problem is they didn't. And what do we do with them? Well, we put them into a boarding school and hope for the best. And it didn't turn out that way.
When we had you on talking about your other book, We Remain, which is more of a book looking at the American,
bigger picture.
The bigger picture. We got into this a little bit, and I think I would like to finish up our conversation about the Thomas Indian School with hopefully getting some thoughts on this. We know this. We're starting to know the stories, and it's worth repeating these stories and making sure that they're out there. At the same time, here we are in 2023. What would you like people to know and understand about Indians and Indian culture? That could be, because so much of those stereotypes that we grew up with, that still lingers into the modern conversation to a certain extent.
I mean, my daughter is in graduate school and is teaching that, and was told, there are no more Indians left. The students told her that. I mean,
right.
Not the other faculty members, I hope. But people do not know much about Indians, and yet they're a central part of American history. As I say in my other book, Native American history is American history. You can't really teach American history if you're a faculty member, a professor, or a high school teacher without talking about Indians. And yet most people know very little about them. What they learn is, of course, from Westerns and that sort of thing, and they know cheap gas around here and cigarettes on the reservation, or they go to casinos, which are not usually run by Indians, but they're run by white people on behalf of the Indians. They don't know very much about them, and so what we need to do is educate them, and that's what this book does, and I think my other book as well, tells the story of a really sad story, a very sad story. I was just thinking of a Thanksgiving meal I went to on a Crow Indian reservation several years ago. I can't remember now when it was. But at any rate, it was a normal Thanksgiving meal, big family. And, I was the only white guy there.
Okay.
and they honored me, as a matter of fact, for coming so far to be with them. I've been around there quite a bit. They know me very well. And, it was all the same. It looked the same. The turkey and all the fixings and kids running around and everybody, a big family getting together in this kind of metal building on a reservation, on a Crow reservation in Montana. And the question is, and I've told people about that, and they said, well, what are they celebrating? Well, they're not celebrating America. They're not part of the American pageant, American drama. So they're not celebrating that. There was nobody there with pilgrim hats on, and
right.
like at the school plays. And
not celebrating the Mayflower.
Yeah, not celebrating the Mayflower or any of that sort of thing. And what were they celebrating? Well, this gave them an occasion to get together and celebrate the fact that they were Indians. And they love being Indians. And the people ask me all the time, why don't they just leave? I mean, the conditions on Crow are horrible. The last time I was there, I came back and I told my wife, I don't know if I can go back. I saw some things that I won't describe, but really depressed me. And like I said, I've shed a lot of tears over these things. But for them, being an Indian is something that in which they find joy, and they're celebrating it. They just want to be Indians. And like I said, one of my Indian friends said, there's nothing wrong with that. No. And that's what I'd like people to know. They're really generous, giving, enjoyable people. Leave them alone. That's my message. Yeah, it's hard for people to believe, I think white people to understand and feel the kind of things that they feel. And one of the reasons is, of course, that white people haven't been through the kind of trauma that Indians share, and which is part of their identity. They've suffered a great deal, and they survived, and they're proud of it.
Dr. Keith Burich, thank you very much for joining us today. What's next?
Well, thank you for having me, and I'll write another book soon, and actually, there is a book that.
Oh, is that right?
Don't ask my wife about this because she doesn't want me getting involved again. There's another school on Seneca called Quaker Bridge or Tonasasa. Nobody knows about that one either, but I'm thinking of doing a book on that as well.
Down at Allegheny?
Allegheny, yeah, right. He was on sort of the Allegheny River, right by, where the reservoir is now.
Yes.
It was inundated by the reservoir. So, but it closed in 1936, okay. And I'm thinking of doing a book on that. So maybe you can have me back on that.
And we might have to have you back several times for just a general discussion. We most certainly appreciate it.
Well, I always appreciate this, and thank you very much.
Dr. Keith Burich, his book that we're talking about today, The Thomas Indian School and the quote-unquote Irredeemable Children of New York. This has been What's Next on WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown, your NPR station.